We shouldn't have stayed out so late. It was my idea, of course. I wanted to capture the quiet beauty of the park at night. The way the moonlight transformed the trees into blackened, skeletal shapes. Besides, it was one of those rare nights when we didn't have to rush home, didn't have to worry about deadlines or work, or anything that would drag us back into reality. So we found a bench, tucked under a pair of oak trees, and sat in comfortable silence, letting the midnight calm wrap around us like a blanket. It must have been around midnight when I first noticed them. At first, they were just flickers, little movements darting between the trees at the edge of my vision. I dismissed them, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the flickers grew more distinct, more purposeful. I nudged Emily, who was dozing with her head on my shoulder. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "See what?" she mumbled, half asleep. "There between the trees," I pointed, trying to make sense of the shadows, and then we both saw it. A small figure, no more than 3 feet tall, stood partially hidden behind a tree trunk. It was just watching us, as if it knew we'd noticed it. Its body was dark, not just in color, but as if it absorbed all the light around it, a shadow cut out of the night itself. It shifted slightly, and that's when I realized something was wrong, terribly, horribly wrong. It didn't have a face. My breath caught in my throat. "What the hell is that?" Emily's voice trembled, her eyes wide now, fully awake. More of them appeared, slipping out from behind the trees, small shadowy figures moving in that same jerky, unnatural way, like marionettes with invisible strings. They circled us slowly, and I realized they were playing, mimicking the motions of a child's game, hopscotch, jump rope, games that every child knows, but without any toys in their hands, just those empty, faceless heads turning toward us, as if they could see us despite the lack of eyes. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Emily's arm. "Now." We stood up, trying to move away as calmly as possible. But as soon as we took a step, the shadow children stopped playing. They froze, all their heads turning in unison to face us. My heart hammered in my chest, and I tightened my grip on Emily's hand. "Run," I whispered, and we bolted. We sprinted down the path, branches whipping at our faces, feet pounding against the dirt. But no matter how fast we ran, the shadow children were faster. They appeared ahead of us, cutting us off, moving in that nightmarish, disjointed way, and we stumbled to a halt, panting and desperate. "Play with us," one of them whispered. The voice was soft, childlike, but it crawled up my spine like ice. "Play with us forever." The words echoed, repeated by each one in turn, until the whispering became a chorus, a haunting lullaby that surrounded us. I felt Emily's grip tighten, her nails digging into my skin. "This isn't real," she muttered, shaking her head. "It can't be real." I wished she were right, but the air had grown colder, the warmth of the summer night vanishing, replaced by a biting chill that made my breath puff out in white clouds. The park around us seemed to change too. The trees grew taller, twisted, their branches bending at impossible angles, and the path beneath our feet crumbled into dust, leaving us standing on a patch of barren, frozen earth. We tried to back away, but the shadow children formed a circle around us, closing in slowly. Their hands reached out, fingers extending impossibly long, thin as twigs, and they touched us cold, intangible touches that seeped into my skin like needles of ice. I wanted to scream, to shove them away, but my body wouldn't obey. I could feel the warmth draining out of me, my skin turning numb, and I knew that if they touched me for too long, I'd be frozen in place, just like them. "No," I gasped, yanking Emily behind me, trying to protect her. "You can't have us." The shadow children paused, their heads tilting in unison, as if considering my defiance. And then, one by one, they began to hum, a low, haunting melody that grew louder, wrapping around us, squeezing tighter. My vision blurred, darkness creeping in at the edges, and I could feel myself slipping away, falling into that icy, endless black. But then Emily did something I'll never forget. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, fingers trembling as she swiped through the screen. "What are you doing?" I managed to choke out. She didn't finish her sentence, but I saw it, the flashlight app, the small beam of light cutting through the darkness. She pointed it at the nearest shadow child, and the beam hit it like a spotlight. The figure let out an ear-piercing shriek, recoiling, its form flickering as if the light had torn through its very being. "Light!" I whispered. "Emily, the light hurts them." Without another word, we turned on every light we had, phones, keychain flashlights. Even the screen brightness cranked to the maximum. The shadow children shrieked and stumbled back, their bodies dissolving into mist wherever the light touched them. We moved slowly, step by step, forcing them to retreat, until we reached the edge of the park, our feet finding the familiar paved path. And just like that, the spell broke, the air warmed, the trees returned to their normal shapes, and the shadow children melted into the darkness, vanishing as if they had never been there. The whispering stopped, replaced by the gentle hum of city traffic in the distance. We stood there, panting, drenched in sweat, our breaths ragged and shallow. We didn't say anything for a long time. What was there to say? I looked back, half expecting to see them lurking in the shadows, waiting for us to turn our backs. But the park was empty, peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened. "We need to leave," Emily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave now," I nodded, and we stumbled away, our flashlights still on, refusing to let the darkness close in again. We didn't speak on the way back to the car. We didn't even look at each other, too afraid that if we did, we'd see the fear still etched into our faces. We reached my car, climbed inside, and I drove away without looking back. As we pulled out onto the main road, I glanced at Emily, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. She looked pale, but relieved, as if she was already starting to convince herself that it was just some horrible dream. But as I stared at the rearview mirror, my blood turned to ice. There in the back seat, I saw the faint outline of a small, shadowy figure, its head tilted to one side, faceless yet staring at me. And I swear, as we drove away, I heard that same chilling whisper echo in my ears one last time. "Play with us forever." I had always been drawn to places that others found unsettling. It was as if my artist's eye craved the odd and the unnatural, urging me to seek out the strange corners of the world. That's why, on a warm summer night, I found myself wandering through the city park, sketchbook in hand, my steps leading me to a pond at the park's edge. One I had never noticed before. It wasn't on any map, and no one I'd spoken to had ever mentioned it, yet there it was, shimmering under the pale light of the moon. The air was thick, heavy with a humidity that clung to my skin like a wet blanket, but despite the oppressive heat, the surface of the pond was frozen solid, a sheen of ice that seemed impossible in this weather. It was a contradiction, a silent defiance of nature, and it drew me in. I sat on a nearby bench, opening my sketchbook with a kind of reverence. My fingers itched to capture the scene, the smooth surface of the ice, the dark trees leaning over the pond like sentinels, their branches twisting unnaturally. I let my pencil move across the page, sketching quickly, the image forming in sharp, jagged lines. As I worked, I felt a shift, an unease that settled into my bones. The park, usually filled with distant sounds of traffic and life, had fallen completely silent. The stillness was suffocating, a silence so deep that I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something beneath the ice, a dark shape, distorted and barely visible, but undeniably there. I leaned forward, squinting in the dim light, and my stomach dropped. There was a face, no, not just a face, faces. Multiple figures were trapped under the ice, their expressions twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes stared up at me, wide and pleading, their hands frozen just inches from the surface, as if they had been trying to break free in their last moments. I dropped my pencil. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe this was some kind of strange art installation, an elaborate prank, anything to rationalize what I was seeing. But the more I stared, the more real it became. The ice wasn't just reflecting shapes. These were people, and they were moving. One of the figures, a woman with tangled hair and sunken eyes, began to press her hand against the ice. Slowly, painfully, her fingers twitched, her palm flattening against the surface, her knuckles white, as if she were using every ounce of her strength to push through. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but the desperation in her expression was unmistakable. I stumbled back, my feet crunching against the grass. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the air itself had thickened around me, rooting me to the spot. I looked down at my feet, panic rising in my throat, and realized I couldn't move. My legs were glued to the ground, the cold seeping through the soles of my shoes, spreading upward, wrapping around my ankles like icy chains. I looked back at the pond, at the figures under the ice. They were all moving now. One by one, their hands pressed against the surface, their mouths opening and closing in a silent chorus of agony. The ice creaked, cracks spider-webbing outward from where their hands touched, as if the barrier between us was weakening. I yanked at my legs, trying to free myself, but it was no use. The cold had climbed higher, numbing my knees, my thighs. I felt the ice beneath me now, even though I wasn't standing on the pond. It was spreading, creeping through the grass, turning everything in its path into a frozen wasteland. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, visible in the air despite the summer heat. I glanced at the water's edge and caught sight of my reflection, or what should have been my reflection. Instead of my face, I saw a pale, gaunt version of myself staring back. The reflection's eyes were wide with terror, its mouth open in a silent scream, hands pressed against an invisible barrier, mirroring the trapped souls beneath the ice. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what was happening. That wasn't just a reflection, it was me, or rather, it was becoming me. The more I stared, the clearer the connection became. The face in the ice was desperate, terrified, pleading for help, and I was sinking into it. The ice continued to spread, curling around my chest, my arms, my fingers. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The cold had stolen my voice, freezing it in my throat. My reflection's mouth was still moving, though, still screaming for help that would never come. I clawed at the ground, trying to pull myself free, but my hands slid uselessly over the frozen grass. The figures beneath the ice watched me, their expressions slowly changing. They were no longer desperate. They were expectant, hungry. A cracking sound echoed through the silence, louder than before. I looked down, horrified, as the ice beneath me splintered. Thin lines spread out from my feet, crawling across the ground like a living thing. The pond itself seemed to pulse, the figures trapped beneath it pressing harder against the surface, their eyes locked on mine. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my reflection's face, twisted in agony, lips forming the same words I had seen in the faces of the trapped figures. Help me. When I woke, it was daylight. The sun was high, the park alive with the sound of birds and distant voices. I was lying by the edge of the pond, the sketchbook still open beside me. I scrambled to my feet, looking around, my heart racing. Everything was back to normal. The ice was gone, the pond's surface calm and clear. But as I turned to leave, my body trembling, I glanced down at the water and froze. Beneath the surface, just barely visible, I saw a face. My face, pale and twisted, pressed against the ice that shouldn't be there. Its eyes met mine, and though it couldn't speak, I understood the message it was sending. It wasn't over. We were a group of 5 that night, each of us driven by the same thrill-seeking stupidity that comes with youth. Kevin, the loudest of us, was the one who brought up the legend first as we sat around the fire at his backyard, nursing beers and laughing at each other's ridiculous dares. "Have you heard about the carousel in Maplewood Park?" he said, his voice tinged with the excitement of someone about to drop a bombshell. "They say it only shows up on the night of the full moon." "Bullshit," I laughed, shaking my head, but part of me knew exactly what he was talking about. Everyone in town had heard the stories. An old carousel supposedly abandoned decades ago that would mysteriously appear in the park under the light of a full moon. Its faded horses frozen in eerie silence, a ghost story, a local myth, nothing more, except tonight was a full moon. "Well, if you're so sure it's bullshit, let's go check it out," Kevin challenged, his eyes gleaming. And just like that, the dare was set. We were drunk enough, brave enough, or maybe just stupid enough to agree. It was nearly midnight when we finally reached the park, our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The air had an electric chill to it, and the light from the moon was unnaturally bright, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. As we approached the center of the park, we saw it, the carousel. It stood in a clearing, its paint peeling, the horses frozen in mid-prance, their chipped wooden eyes staring blankly into the night. It was bigger than I'd imagined, a faded masterpiece of age and decay, and for a moment none of us could move. It shouldn't be here. It wasn't here during the day, and yet here it stood, as if it had always been waiting. "No way," Jenna whispered, clutching my arm. How is it real?" "Probably some kind of prank," I muttered, though even I didn't believe it. The air felt wrong. Heavy, it smelled faintly of rust and something sweeter, like rotting flowers. Kevin grinned, always the first to break the silence. "I say we take a ride. Are you insane?" Sarah snapped, backing away. "This is creepy as hell. Let's go." But Kevin was already stepping forward, dragging Mike with him. "Come on, just one ride. What's the worst that could happen? There's always a moment in every horror story where you can turn back, where you can choose to walk away." We didn't. Kevin climbed onto one of the horses, a black stallion with chipped paint and a cracked glass eye, and Mike followed, a nervous smile plastered on his face. "See? Harmless," Kevin called out. "Who's next?" Against my better judgment, I stepped forward, hoisting myself onto a nearby horse. The wood felt cold beneath my hands, and for a second I could have sworn I felt it twitch. I shook my head. It was just my imagination. Jenna and Sarah reluctantly joined us, each picking a horse, until all 5 of us were seated, facing each other in a circle. "Okay, Kevin, you had your fun," Sarah said, clearly done with this whole adventure. "Can we go now?" That's when the music started. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, a haunting tune that seemed to float out of the shadows. The kind of melody that you'd hear in an old music box, worn and broken, with notes that lingered just a second too long. Then the carousel began to turn, slowly, creaking with age, but there was no power, no lights, nothing to explain how it was moving. "Kevin, cut it out," Jenna snapped, her voice rising in panic. "How are you doing this?" "I'm not doing anything," Kevin protested, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes now. The horses began to twitch, their heads jerking, limbs stiffly moving, as if they were waking up after a long sleep. I tried to climb off, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if I was glued to the saddle, stuck, trapped. I yanked at my legs, at my hands, but they wouldn't budge. The carousel picked up speed, faster and faster, the music growing louder, more distorted, the notes twisting into something that sounded like laughter. That's when I saw it. The horse I was sitting on, its eyes began to open, slowly, unnaturally, glass cracking as the lids peeled back to reveal what was hidden beneath. It wasn't eyes at all. It was teeth, rows upon rows of tiny, jagged teeth, glistening in the moonlight, wet with something that looked like saliva. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. All around me, the other horses were waking up too. Their heads twisted toward us, necks bending in ways that shouldn't be possible, mouths opening, revealing more teeth, sharp and hungry. The carousel spun faster, the wind whipping against my face, and I could feel the horse beneath me moving, its wooden body stretching, shifting, as if the very wood was alive. "Get off, get off!" Mike screamed, trying to pry himself free, but the horse's mane had tangled around his hands, pulling him back, holding him in place. I twisted, struggling, but every movement seemed to make the horse's grip tighter. Jenna was crying. Sarah was shouting at Kevin to do something, anything, but he was too busy trying to free himself from the horse's grasp. The music became a deafening roar, drowning out our screams, and I felt a sudden searing pain in my leg as the horse's teeth dug into me. They were eating us. I could feel the warmth of my own blood dripping down, seeping into the wood, and I knew, somehow I knew, that this carousel had fed before, that it had been waiting for us, for years, decades maybe, just waiting for someone to be stupid enough to take a ride. "No," I yelled, yanking with all my strength, tearing myself free just enough to reach for Jenna's hand. "We have to jump now." In one desperate motion, I threw myself off the horse, dragging Jenna with me. We hit the ground hard, rolling across the dirt, scraping skin, but we were free. Mike, Sarah, and Kevin weren't so lucky. Their horses twisted, the wood cracking open like flesh, swallowing them whole, their screams merging with the carousel's nightmarish melody. I scrambled to my feet, dragging Jenna, running as fast as I could, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we reached the trees, collapsing against a trunk, gasping for breath. The carousel was slowing now, its grotesque music fading, and as I forced myself to look back, I saw the figures of my friends, motionless, lifeless, carved into the horses, as if they had always been part of them. Kevin's eyes, now glassy, stared out from the black stallion, forever frozen in a silent scream. The carousel stopped, the music died, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Jenna and I stumbled back to town in silence, the dawn creeping over the horizon, the nightmare fading with the light. But as we reached the edge of the park, I glanced back one last time, and my heart stopped. There, in the faint glow of the rising sun, I saw it, a single faded horse's head, peeking out from the shadows, its eyes open wide, staring right at me, and I knew it was waiting.